When I speak of the moment an empath snaps, I am not referring to a theatrical outburst, nor to the vulgar image of anger that modern language so casually employs. I am speaking of a psychic event of rare gravity, one that unfolds not on the surface of behavior but in the deep strata of the soul. You must understand this from the outset, for the empath is not merely a kind person who has been pushed too far. The empath is a particular psychic configuration, a vessel shaped by an unusual permeability between the conscious personality and the surrounding psychic field. Such a person does not merely listen to others, they absorb. They do not merely witness suffering, they internalize it as if it were their own. Their psyche, like an unguarded threshold, allows foreign contents to pass inward with little resistance. For many years, this condition appears virtuous, even admirable. Society praises it. The individual mistakes it for moral superiority. Yet in the depths, something else is occurring, something far more dangerous. I want you to imagine the psyche not as a simple container, but as a living system of tensions, opposite, and compensations. Nothing in the psyche remains unbalanced without consequence. If one pole is exaggerated, its opposite grows in the unconscious with equal force. The empath lives in an exaggerated orientation toward the other. Their consciousness is turned outward, constantly attuned to moods, needs, wounds, and unspoken conflicts. Their own aggression, selfishness, and instinctual will to power do not disappear. They are merely denied entry into consciousness. Where do they go? Then they descend, they sink into the shadow, and there, in the darkness, they do not wither, they ferment. I have encountered such individuals in my clinical work, though they did not come to me saying, "I am an empath." They came exhausted, confused, often depressed, sometimes plagued by dreams of violence or catastrophe that shocked their waking morality. Outwardly, they were gentle, accommodating, endlessly forgiving. Inwardly, however, the unconscious was preparing a reckoning. The psyche, like nature itself, demands equilibrium. What is not lived consciously will be lived unconsciously, and often in a form that terrifies the ego. The empath's tragedy begins with identification. They identify with the archetype of the healer, the helper, the bearer of others' pain. This archetype is ancient and powerful, older than any individual personality. To identify with it without sufficient consciousness is to invite possession. The person no longer helps, they must help. They no longer listen, they cannot stop listening. The ego is gradually colonized by a role, and the authentic self recedes. At first, this feels meaningful. There is a sense of purpose, of being needed, of moral clarity. But notice what is missing: limits. Boundaries are not merely social conventions, they are psychic membranes. Without them, the psyche cannot regulate what enters and what must remain outside. Over time, the empath accumulates unprocessed affect. Every unexpressed resentment, every swallowed no, every moment of silent self-betrayal adds weight to an invisible burden. Because the empath is skilled at understanding others, they are equally skilled at explaining away their own suffering. They rationalize abuse as ignorance, manipulation as trauma, exploitation as misunderstanding. The intellect becomes a servant of repression. This is why I say the empath snap is terrifying. It is not impulsive. It is prepared over years of apparent patience. The unconscious, however, does not speak in polite language. It speaks in images, in dreams, in symptoms. An empath on the brink often dreams of floods, of dams breaking, of animals turning feral, of houses collapsing from within. They may dream of being chased or of committing acts that horrify them upon waking. Such dreams are not predictions of moral failure. They are messages. They say something contained too long is seeking release. The water has risen behind the wall. The animal has been starved. The house has been built upon a fault line. Now let me describe the moment itself, not as a dramatic scene, but as a psychological transformation. When the empath snaps, it is as if the shadow, long ignored, seizes the steering wheel. The ego, exhausted from its one-sided virtue, can no longer maintain control. What emerges may look like cruelty, coldness, or ruthless clarity. To observers, it seems sudden and inexplicable. They were so kind. People say, I never imagined this, but the unconscious had imagined it for a long time. This eruption is terrifying precisely because it carries moral certainty. The shadow does not feel evil to the person experiencing it. It feels justified. Years of unspoken anger now speak with the voice of fate. The empath may cut people off without explanation, speak truths with surgical brutality, or withdraw all emotional supply as if turning off a tap. There is often no apology because the psyche is no longer negotiating. It is compensating. What was too soft becomes hard. What was too yielding becomes unyielding. You must not misunderstand me here. I am not condemning this moment, nor am I glorifying it. I am describing it. The snap is not enlightenment. It is a crisis of integration. It is the psyche's emergency response to prolonged imbalance. If consciousness does not widen to include the shadow voluntarily, the shadow forces its way in. In some cases, the empath's snap takes an even darker form. The repressed aggression may not simply assert boundaries, it may seek domination, revenge, or annihilation of the other. This is particularly likely when the empath has been entangled with individuals who exploit their sensitivity. The unconscious logic is brutal but simple. If I have been consumed, I will consume. Here we encounter the archetype of the avenger, rising from the ruins of the healer. The same energy that once served compassion now serves destruction. Energy itself is neutral. Its moral color depends on consciousness. The terrifying aspect, from a Jungian perspective, is that the empath often experiences this shift as a kind of awakening. There is relief, even exhilaration. The exhaustion lifts, the fog clears. For the first time, they feel powerful. This is why the danger is so great. Power without consciousness is always seductive. The ego, having suffered so long, may cling to the shadow's strength and refuse further integration. The person swings from one extreme to the other, mistaking compensation for wholeness. Yet the psyche does not aim for extremes, it aims for totality. The true task, which few undertake willingly, is to hold both poles, to feel empathy without self-erasure, to assert boundaries without cruelty, to recognize one's capacity for aggression without acting it out blindly. This is the work of individuation, and it is far more demanding than either saintliness or rebellion. If you are listening to me and feel a quiet recognition stirring, do not rush to judge yourself. The empath snap is not a personal failure, it is a symbolic event. It tells a story about a consciousness that tried to live as an angel and discovered, too late, that it also contained an animal. The goal was never to kill the animal, nor to let it devour everything, but to acknowledge it, to give it a place at the table of the psyche. The most terrifying cases I encountered were not those where the empath erupted, but those where they did not, where the aggression turned inward instead, becoming chronic depression, autoimmune illness, or a pervasive sense of meaninglessness. The psyche will have its balance one way or another. The snap, at least, is a signal that life is still moving, that energy has not completely stagnated. What matters is what comes after. If the individual can reflect, can symbolically understand what has happened, the snap may become a threshold rather than a catastrophe. If not, it becomes a repetition, a new prison built from the opposite wall. I speak to you not to frighten you, but to awaken responsibility. Sensitivity is not innocence. Empathy is not holiness. They are powers, and like all powers, they demand consciousness. When you deny your shadow, you do not become good, you become dangerous in ways you cannot foresee. And when the day comes that the empath snaps, the world is forced to confront not a monster that appeared from nowhere, but a truth that was ignored for far too long, and which even now continues to unfold in the depths where the next image, the next dream, the next demand of the psyche is already forming, waiting for consciousness to either meet it or once again turn away. You may wonder why I linger so long in the darkness of this phenomenon, why I do not hasten toward reassurance or resolution. It is because the psyche itself does not hurry past its own truth. When an empath snaps, something irrevocable has already occurred long before the visible rupture. A covenant has been broken within the soul, a silent agreement to betray oneself for the sake of harmony. The snap is merely the audible crack of a structure that has been failing for years. Let us descend further, for only by descending can we understand what truly moves here. The empath often believes they are choosing love over power, understanding over domination, softness over force. But this is a false opposition created by consciousness itself. In reality, power has not been renounced, it has been displaced. The will to power, denied its rightful expression in conscious life, migrates into the unconscious, where it grows distorted, autonomous, and archaic. It becomes no longer human power, shaped by reflection and ethics, but instinctual power, blind and absolute. This is why the snap so often carries a mythic quality. The person does not merely say, "Enough." They feel as if a god has spoken through them. The language changes, the tone becomes final. Relationships that endured decades collapse in a single conversation. It is not the ego speaking, but a deeper authority that has waited patiently for its moment. In this sense, The empath's snap is a form of possession, not by demon in the theological sense, but by an archetypal force that overwhelms the personal ego. I recall a dream recounted by such an individual shortly after their transformation. They dreamed of standing in a quiet village as a volcano erupted beneath it, not with fire, but with black water. The water flooded the streets, swallowing houses, while the dreamer stood untouched, strangely calm. When I asked what they felt in the dream, they replied, "Relief, this is the key." The unconscious does not measure morality as society does. It measures balance. The flood was destructive, yes, but it also washed away a suffocating stagnation. Do not underestimate the role of fear in the empath's long silence. Many such individuals are deeply afraid of their own anger, not because it is especially violent, but because it contradicts their identity. They have built their sense of self upon being the safe one, the understanding one, the one who does not wound. To acknowledge their aggression feels like psychic death, and in a sense, it is. The old identity must die for the psyche to reorganize itself. This is why the snap feels both catastrophic and liberating. Something has ended, and something unknown has begun, yet there is a grave danger here, one that I must name clearly. When the empath snaps, they are tempted to reverse the moral polarity entirely. Where once they blamed themselves for everything, they now blame others for everything. Where once they dissolved their boundaries, they now erect walls of iron. This reversal is not integration, it is reaction. The psyche swings like a pendulum, and the individual mistakes the movement for progress. True integration is far less dramatic and far more difficult. It requires the ego to remain conscious while admitting previously rejected qualities. It asks the empath to say, "Yes, I am capable of cruelty without becoming cruel. Yes, I desire power without abusing it. Yes, I can abandon without turning abandonment into a principle." This is slow work, unglamorous work, and it rarely earns applause, but it is the only work that leads to wholeness. You must understand that empathy itself is not a virtue if it is unconscious. Unconscious empathy is merely permeability. It lacks discrimination, it absorbs poison and nourishment alike. Conscious empathy, by contrast, is selective. It knows when to open and when to close. It can feel with another without dissolving into them. This distinction is crucial, and most empaths are never taught it. They are praised for their sacrifice, not warned about its cost. The snap, then, is a brutal teacher. It teaches boundaries through pain, discernment through loss. Often, after the snap, the empath finds themselves strangely alone. Old relationships fall away, familiar roles no longer fit. There is grief here, profound grief, and it must not be bypassed. To numb it with cynicism or spiritual superiority is to invite another imbalance. Grief is the psyche's way of honoring what was real, even if it was unsustainable. In some cases, the snap awakens a creative force. The energy once consumed by emotional labor becomes available for imagination, thought, and action. Individuals who never wrote begin to write. Those who never spoke begin to speak. There is often a sense of destiny, as if life has finally begun, This too must be held with caution. Inflation is always a risk after long repression. The ego, newly empowered, may overestimate its wisdom and underestimate its blind spots. What distinguishes a terrifying case from a transformative one is not the intensity of the snap, but the presence of reflection afterward. Does the individual ask, "What in me contributed to this?" Or do they ask only, "How could others do this to me?" The first question opens the path of individuation. The second seals it shut. I speak now directly to you, not as a theoretician, but as a witness to the soul's necessity. If you feel the pressure building within you, the quiet resentment, the fatigue that sleep does not cure, do not wait for the snap. Listen to the symptoms, attend to the dreams. Notice where your yes is a lie and your kindness a mask. To set a boundary early feels cruel to the persona. To set it late feels catastrophic to the psyche. The unconscious is not your enemy. It does not seek to punish you. It seeks to complete you, but it speaks in the language of symbols, not social niceties. If you ignore its whispers, it will shout. If you refuse its images, it will give you events. The empath's snap is one such event, a symbolic drama enacted in real life because it was never allowed symbolic expression within. Remember this, the goal is not to stop being empathetic, nor to harden yourself against the world. The goal is to become a vessel strong enough to contain empathy without drowning in it. This requires a firm ego, capable of saying I without apology. Only then can compassion flow without turning poisonous. As we continue, you must keep in mind that what I describe is not a pathology reserved for a few sensitive souls. It is a pattern that repeats wherever goodness is lived without consciousness, wherever light is pursued without shadow, wherever sacrifice replaces responsibility. And it is precisely here, in this unresolved tension, that the psyche prepares its next movement, quietly, patiently, shaping the form that has not yet emerged but already presses from within. We must now turn our attention to what happens in the inner landscape after the ground has shifted, after the empath has crossed that invisible threshold beyond which return to the old configuration is impossible. This is the phase that few speak of, because it lacks the drama of rupture and the moral clarity of outrage. It is a liminal territory, neither the old self nor the new. And it is here that the true danger and the true promise reside side by side. In this aftermath, the empath often feels an eerie stillness. The constant background hum of other people's emotions has quieted. There is space where there was once noise. At first, this silence is intoxicating. It feels like freedom, like finally coming home to oneself. Yet silence, like darkness, is ambiguous. It reveals what had been drowned out. Into this space emerge questions that were long postponed. Who am I when I am no longer needed? What remains when my value is no longer measured by my usefulness to others? These questions can unsettle the psyche far more deeply than the original injustice that precipitated the snap. Many empaths at this stage experience what I would call a loss of meaning. The old moral narrative no longer holds. They cannot return to their previous self without self-betrayal. Yet the new self has not fully taken form. This is the classic structure of a death and rebirth archetype. though lived psychologically rather than ritually. In myths, the hero descends into the underworld, loses their former identity, and returns transformed. But myths conceal the duration of this descent. In real life, it can last years. Dreams during this period often feature deserted landscapes, abandoned houses, or long journeys without a clear destination. These images speak of psychic territory that has been vacated but not yet re-inhabited. The empath may feel strangely unmotivated, even apathetic, and fear that something essential has been lost. In truth, something essential has indeed been lost. The persona that once organized their life, what has not yet been found, is a new center. Here, the temptation to adopt a new mask is strong. Some empaths replace the persona of the selfless helper with that of the hardened realist or the enlightened survivor. This too is a defense, an attempt to regain certainty, but any identity that forms too quickly after a psychic rupture is suspect. The psyche needs time to reorganize its energy, to discover what genuinely belongs and what was merely reactive. I must emphasize that this phase is not a failure of healing, it is healing. Modern consciousness is impatient with such ambiguity. It demands answers, labels, progress, but the unconscious operates by different laws. It withdraws energy from obsolete structures before investing it elsewhere. To force meaning prematurely is to risk building upon ruins. At this stage, the shadow continues its work, but now it is no longer erupting violently. Instead, it presents itself through subtle impulses, fleeting fantasies, or moral doubts. The empath may notice an unfamiliar enjoyment in saying no, in disappointing others, even in being misunderstood. This enjoyment can provoke guilt, which is itself a sign that the psyche is renegotiating its moral economy. Guilt here is not a sign of wrongdoing, it is a signal that old values are being challenged. Yet, if guilt is denied or repressed, it can turn toxic, driving the individual either back into self-sacrifice or further into cynicism. Conscious guilt, on the other hand, can be endured. It can be examined, it can teach. This is one of the most difficult lessons for the empath, to tolerate being the bad object in someone else's story without rushing to repair it. You see, the empath was once unconsciously dependent on being seen as good. This dependency is rarely acknowledged, but it is powerful. When it collapses, the psyche must learn a new way of relating to others, one that does not rely on moral approval. This is a profound shift, and it often feels like standing without armor in a strange land. There is also, in this phase, a confrontation with solitude, not loneliness, which seeks to be filled, but solitude, which asks to be inhabited. The empath may discover that much of their former connection to others was a way of avoiding themselves. This realization can be painful, even humiliating, but it is also liberating. For the first time, the individual is invited into a direct relationship with their own inner life, unmediated by the needs of others. If the empath can endure this solitude without fleeing into distraction or new dependencies, something remarkable begins to occur. A different quality of feeling emerges, quieter and more grounded. Empathy returns, but it is no longer compulsive. It arises freely and recedes freely. The psyche begins to regulate itself. This is the birth of conscious empathy, which is inseparable from self-respect. It does not seek to save, nor does it fear rejection. It can remain present without absorption. In archetypal terms, the healer is no longer a sacrificial figure but a sovereign one. They help because they choose to, not because they must. However, I must warn you that this development is fragile. Old patterns can reassert themselves under stress. The world will test the new configuration relentlessly. People accustomed to the old empath will attempt, often unconsciously, to pull them back into familiar roles. Resistance will provoke discomfort, even hostility. This is not evidence of failure, it is evidence of change. The empath must now learn a new discernment. Not everyone who suffers is entitled to their inner resources. This truth can feel shocking, even cruel, until it is fully integrated, but without it, empathy remains indiscriminate and therefore dangerous. In this sense, the empath's journey mirrors that of the mystic who returns from the desert. They have seen something that cannot be explained to those who remained behind. They are no longer entirely at home in the old world, yet they must live in it. This tension is permanent, and it is the price of consciousness. As we approach the final movement of this inquiry, you must hold in mind that the empath snap was never the end of the story. It was the end of a lie. What follows is not guaranteed transformation, but the possibility of it, and possibility in the psyche is always accompanied by risk. The next step is not dictated by fate, but by attention, by willingness to suffer meaningfully, and by the courage to remain present as the unconscious prepares its final demand, which will not arrive as an explosion, but as a quiet, insistent question asking whether you are now prepared to live what you have learned. There comes a moment, often long after the noise has faded and the crisis has been absorbed into memory, when the empath realizes that the most dangerous temptation was never the cruelty of others, nor even the violence of the shadow, but the longing to be finished. The psyche does not seek closure in the way the intellect does. It seeks circulation, it seeks a living tension that can be borne without collapse. And this final movement is not a conclusion, but a stabilization of opposites that must be renewed again and again. At this stage, the empath begins to sense a different center of gravity within. No longer is it located in the reactions of others, nor even in the dramatic assertions of the newly discovered shadow. It is quieter, more inward, and at first almost disappointing. There is no triumph here, no sense of having arrived. Instead, there is a sober awareness of limits. The empath learns that they cannot save everyone, cannot be understood by everyone, cannot even fully understand themselves. This acceptance, which appears modest, is in fact a profound psychological achievement. What has changed most radically is the relationship to suffering. Previously, suffering in others demanded immediate response, as if it were an accusation. Now it is perceived as a fact of existence, tragic but not always actionable. This shift does not harden the heart, it frees it. Compassion is no longer fused with urgency. It can witness without being consumed. In symbolic terms, the empath has moved from the role of the bleeding healer to that of the watchful guardian. This transformation is often accompanied by a new relationship to anger. Anger is no longer feared nor indulged. It is consulted. It becomes a messenger rather than a tyrant. When anger arises, the empath asks not how to suppress it or unleash it, but what boundary has been crossed, what value threatened, what truth ignored. Anger thus re-enters consciousness as a discriminating force, aligned with self-respect. You may notice that language itself changes at this point. The compulsive explanations fall away. The need to justify, to persuade, to soften every edge diminishes. Speech becomes simpler, more direct. Silence, too, acquires a different meaning. It is no longer a withdrawal born of exhaustion, but a choice. This is one of the clearest signs that the psyche has reorganized itself around a stronger ego. Yet do not imagine that the shadow disappears. On the contrary, it becomes more visible, but visibility is not the same as domination. The empath now recognizes in themselves the same capacities they once feared in others: envy, aggression, indifference, even a cold enjoyment of power. To see these without moral panic is a mark of psychological maturity. The shadow, once a threat, becomes a source of realism in relationships. This maturity expresses itself as a willingness to let others be disappointed. The empath no longer rushes to repair every rupture. They understand that some bonds cannot survive honesty, and that this is not always a tragedy. Loss is integrated as part of life, not as evidence of failure. The fear of abandonment, which once fueled endless accommodation, loosens its grip. This does not mean that the empath becomes isolated or aloof. Rather, relationships become fewer and deeper. They are no longer maintained by guilt or obligation, but by mutual recognition. There is a new respect for reciprocity, for the flow of giving and receiving. Where this flow is absent, the empath can now withdraw without self-condemnation. Spiritually, if I may use that word with care, the empath's experience often leads to a quieter faith in the psyche itself. They have seen what happens when inner laws are violated, when one-sidedness is lived to its extreme. They have also seen the psyche's capacity to heal through crisis. This engenders a humility toward the unconscious, a willingness to listen rather than control. And now we return, finally, to the terror implicit in the title of this inquiry. The day the empath snaps is terrifying not because it reveals evil, but because it reveals truth without mediation. It shows what happens when consciousness abdicates its responsibility to integrate its own darkness. The terror lies in the suddenness with which life demands payment for what was deferred. But if you are still listening, if you have followed this descent and ascent, not as a spectator, but as one who recognizes something of themselves, then the terror has already begun to transform. For awareness, once it has seen, cannot fully unsee. The empath who has passed through this ordeal carries a knowledge that cannot be taught, only lived, that goodness without consciousness is fragile, that love without boundaries devours itself, and that the soul, when ignored, does not vanish but waits. In the end, the most terrifying aspect of this case is not the snapping, but the possibility that one might return to sleep afterward, to explain it away as a phase, to harden into bitterness, or to rebuild the old persona with greater sophistication. The work does not end with insight, it begins there. If there is a final image I would leave with you, it is not of explosion or collapse, but of a flame contained within a lantern. The glass does not extinguish the fire, it gives it form. So it is with the empath who has learned to contain their sensitivity within the structure of a conscious self. The light remains, but it no longer burns everything it touches, and in that steady illumination, neither blinding nor dim, the psyche finds a way to move forward, not toward perfection or peace, but toward a living wholeness that can endure the contradictions of being human.